English translation 634th Contact Friday, the 13th of November 2015, 21:32 hours.
Greetings, Eduard, dear friend.
Greetings to you too, my friend. I did not really expect you anymore today, so I just came back to the office to make some corrections to a job. But it's good that you come, because I have some things that arise, including the question of the power of music. Actually, I thought that today we could have corrected together with Bernadette, so I waited the whole day for it.
Unfortunately, I was unable to do so, which is why I am only now getting into a conversation. Tomorrow, Anjana can carry out the correction work.
Unfortunately, this is not possible, because tomorrow we have to work all day, because we have to rent a lifting platform to trim trees that would otherwise break off under snow load.
So you're going to have to be there to control this? Then it will be next week.
So it is, but look here. This is the preamble as it is recorded in the Federal Constitution of Switzerland, and which I find out of place for today.
In the name of God Almighty, the Swiss people and the cantons, in responsibility to creation, in an effort to renew the covenant for freedom and democracy, independence and peace and solidarity and openness towards to strengthen the world's power, in the will, in mutual consideration and respect, their diversity to live in unity, conscious of the common achievements and the responsibility towards future generations, that only those who use their freedom are free, and that the strength of the people is measured by the welfare of the weak, shall have the following constitution.
I have designed a new preamble that you can read and judge here.
Ptaah reads Billy's draft.
New preamble adapted to time for the Swiss Federal Constitution.
In the name of honor, equality, and dignity. To all people of the Swiss people, the country and the cantons, freedom and peace, to maintain and renew the covenant, democracy and justice, neutrality and independence. To be accountable to all creation, in all life, in mutual consideration, and in the respect their diversity to live in unity, in the watchful awareness of common achievements and the obligation to all future generations, certain that only is free, who liberal and tolerant uses his rights and works in openness and solidarity, and strengthens the people, the country, and the world, is measured against the welfare of the weak and honors this in the Constitution. Simyase Silver Star Center, the 5th of November 2015, 2344, Billy.
This is in fact contemporary and apt in relation to what is existing in the federal constitution, which I find inappropriate in such a constitution in relation to in the name of God Almighty, because the whole thing must be rightly related to the people and not to an imaginary God as Almighty.
That's all I wanted to know. But look here. I have something else that Piero and Daniel Lutz took from my computer and prepared for me so that I can show it to you. You are certainly interested in it, because for months now, as you know, people have been penetrating my computer from somewhere outside and manipulating various things I write. And so it happened again when I designed and wrote the preamble. I was just in the final stages when suddenly an Arabic lettering appeared in the middle of the third last line, as you can see here. Here is also the enlargement that Natan then emailed to Badr in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, who did the translation in which reads, "In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful." It's just strange how you can penetrate my computer from the outside and use things, change texts, etc., even though I work locally and not through our computer center.
It's really very strange, like all the other incidents you've told me and for which Zafanat Paniach couldn't find an explanation. When he was busy with your computer to find an answer and a solution for all the strange occurrences, to prevent further similar incidents. You know what precautions we took to ensure that for a few months nothing would have happened that would have been disturbing or even damaging, but for some time now the whole thing has changed again to your disadvantage. And we have no explanation for how everything could come about that you had a few months' rest before attacks, because we found out that the forces working are practically unstoppable. Several of our forces are working on this problem in order to find a solution and effective protection for your computer and your work. But so far there has been nothing that can be applied as final protection. Because frighteningly, we have found that these religious sectarian forces cannot be technically resisted, nor can they be stopped by energy shields. This is especially so because so far no possibility has been found by which an intrusion into your locally working computer could be made possible. But what we do know from our research is the fact that religious sectarian forces undoubtedly work in this way, both Christian and Islamic and Islamist. In this respect, we have now been given the technical opportunity by our friends, the sonar, to define certain such energy vibrations. This was not possible for us until now within the given framework, because these kinds of energy vibrations are based on the energetic effect of thoughts and feelings, and in this case on fanatical religious sectarian mental emotional faith form energies, for which we were not yet able to register and classify such energies, because we were lagging behind the sonars in development in this respect. In contrast to us, the sonar are advantageous to us in terms of various insights, knowledge, techniques and developments, etc., whereby, however, as you know, they are helpful to us through our friendship relationship with all things, so that we were now also allowed to take advantage of apparatuses through which mental emotional energy vibrations can be classified very precisely, analyzed in their strength and determined in their form of action. As a result, we have realized that the energy vibrations are based on religious sectarian thought feelings which are so powerful that a reality is generated by the vibrations, whereby the energetic vibration level changes in such a way that it becomes independent and in this way also begins to work. This means that the religiously sectarian forces do not consciously arise, create and become effective through the delusional faith of the faithful, but rather that they become independent by their own power and produce the most diverse effects through tremendously strong impulses and thus manifest themselves in this way. Religious sectarian energies and their powers are accumulated by the masses of delusional believers of all religions and sects in such a way that they work uninterruptedly over space and time and cause a great deal of harm, generally influencing people in various ways with regard to thoughts and feelings, according to the religious sectarian heresies. This results in many ways in hatred, jealousy, wars and terror as well as vice, etc., as these are prescribed in the heresies, which the mad believer then realizes and adjusts his behavior accordingly, because he is helplessly and defenselessly at the mercy of the independently working energies and their forces and is forced by them to hold on to his belief in delusion and its degenerations. And that these energies and forces, which have made themselves independent and also independently impulsively work in such a way that they cause damage in your computer regarding your work, as they also make some objects, etc., disappear without a trace, in order to also cause damage with it. This is founded in the fact that these religious sectarian energies and forces cause damage against everything which is directed against every religious sectarian delusion.
Then the whole theater can go on, so there is no point in talking about it any further.
At least that's how it is at the moment, because it's a moment. Yes, I must for a short time. I'll be back as soon as possible. I'm afraid it took longer than I thought. Excuse me, dear friend. You know that I don't look ahead anymore, so there is something happening in Paris that I didn't know and that we have to observe and record. Florina and Anjana have been busy with this for some time. I'm sure you can follow a lot of things on TV after my visit because everything is shown in public.
What's the matter with you?
I don't want to talk about that now because you can learn everything later.
Also, well, then we can turn to other things, whereby I want to ask you whether you want to talk today and now about the power of music, and can do what I already suggested in our last conversation, and you said that you just want to do later what could be today.
Of course I can, and so I want to explain the following. There are many types of music, such as aggressive, frightening, provocative, buoyant, malicious, exciting, humiliating, gloomy, delightful, dangerous, violent, horrifying, harmonious, humorous, jubilant, combative, warlike, boring, lovely, loving, murderous, coercing, unconscious, paranoid, psychopathic, riotous, revolting, creeping, longing, sensual, falling in love, destroying, destructive, and compelling forms, among various other species. The power of music in all the variations mentioned has an effect on human emotions and makes them vibrate. And this is because every kind of music has an effect on the body. The thoughts and feelings, and thus also on the psyche, as well as on the consciousness and the whole mental block, and on the subconscious, and on the behavior and action. The situation-related, personality-specific, and music-immanent influencing factors. Billy, immanent in relation to music, inherent in the music, or contained in the music, must be taken into account. Music does not only shape the human being from birth, but already in the prenatal state, because it touches already in the mother's womb the becoming human being in the deep inside of his developing inner being. When a person is born, music can inspire him, even as a young child, as well as in adolescence and adulthood, to composing, as well as to physical, action and thought, emotional, psychological, as well as mental and thus intellectual and rational peak performances, and can also have a healing and thus restorative effect with regard to the same factors. So music certainly has a stimulating as well as an energy-creating and therapeutic power. The power and sounds of music can thus be used by doctors, therapists, and educators, for example, to relieve pain, but also to evoke memories or to overcome psychological barriers. Music can be used therapeutically, neuroscientifically, psychologically, psychiatrically, and evolutively, as well as to facilitate interpersonal communication. Music also promotes in man the function of behavioral development. Consequently, certain sounds, melodies, and harmonies touch him peacefully and in a very special way, while others leave him completely untouched. While others again excite him, and even degenerate him maliciously to murderously and destructively, according to the forms as they were called in the introduction. Music of any kind, no matter whether it is good and pleasing, or whether it can be described as alien to music and harmony and must be called evil, bad, miserable or dangerous, murderous and destructive, as has been the case. For example, since the mid-1980s with bad pop and other unmusical, malicious-sounding noises with blare and roar, etc., affects all levels of the brain. As a result, everything related to really good music and harmony, which includes everything from classical to pop and folk music, as well as everything unmusical and disharmonic of any kind, has a direct access to thoughts, feelings, and emotions. This means that every human being is shaped in his character, personality, thoughts, feelings, and psyche in such a way that he acts and lives out his behavior as his senses are shaped in a musical harmonic or unmusical disharmonic direction. The whole thing has been deeply anchored in the human brain since time immemorial, whereby it has evolved along with the general evolution and helps the human being to reconcile himself with ancient mental, emotional, psychological, as well as emotional needs in a world primarily characterized by language, mind, and reason. Really harmonic sounds, called music, have nothing to do with unmusical. Malicious, disharmonic, discordant noises, booming blasts, and wild roaring, etc., which is called music and misunderstood by earthmen who are disturbed by sound vibrations. Harmonic sounds or music are the expression of universal musical harmonic laws of nature, whereby the whole universe and everything that exists in it makes music in its own way, be it a star, a planet, the sound of the universe, a way of life, the water, the air, or whatever. Musical sounds are universally contained in everything and absolutely common in everything. as is the case with humans, but the forms of harmony or disharmony determine the important role of their behavior, both positive and negative. Many of the universal sounds are not audible to the human ear because the sound vibrations cannot be perceived even with equipment. Also, crystals of all kinds, precious stones, metals of all kinds, rocks and everything and everyone has sound vibrations. So everything that exists in the universe, therefore there is nothing that does not connect sound vibrationally with everything and everyone in a universal way. The sound vibrations of all existences form the universal connection of all things, that is to say, of everything and everyone that exists in the universe, whereby it is also given that all universally existences have knowledge of each other. In this way, the tiniest in the universe has knowledge of the most powerful, like the most powerful has knowledge of the tiniest, starting from the most powerful hypergalaxy to the tiniest spirit energetic particle, which earthly physicists will not be aware of for a long time yet, and which will still provide them with much research work. But how it is that people in all cultures and other life forms on all inhabited worlds in the universe have been creating complicated patterns of sound waves and sound vibrations since the beginning of their existence and history, which produce energies and forces as music, melodies, and rhythms in all life forms, corresponds to a specific law of the universe. Basically, the universe itself is harmonically sound determined, which can also be called music determined. Therefore, music is not a pure human invention because, truthfully, man has taken the musical from the universe and worked out and expanded it according to his needs and wishes, etc. Of all the many natural sounds that already constitute a basic structure of music, man perceives only a few sounds and tones that are produced when things like membranes or strings start to vibrate. But these produce only a few frequencies that are audible to man, which are in a simple and clearly structured relationship to each other. In these few frequencies, however, there is the entire vibrational energy from which clear and widely audible signals emerge, although the human usually consciously perceives only the lowest frequency. The other frequencies always resonate as overtones and determine the timbre, resulting in the difference between different vocal parts and various musical instruments. If the first overtone is used, it is always twice the frequency of the fundamental. If man hears a second tone, the fundamental of which vibrates at this double frequency, then they sound at a distance of 1 octave, and these two tones are considered by humans to be extremely similar. Harmonious sounds or tones, which become music for humans, are created by the brain performing an enormous amount of analysis, namely by effortlessly assigning a complicated mixture of harmonic sound waves or sound oscillations to individual instruments and voices and recognizing musical motifs and phrases in them. The different areas of the entire brain work together so that a specific music center is not responsible for the relevant performance. However, the whole thing does not only result after the birth, because effectively this happens already very early in the womb, namely already from the 21st day after the conception, if the embryo is begestet by the intruding or reincarnating spirit form. Already as an embryo, the growing brain of a child in the womb can classify music, as well as other sounds, tones, and noises, from the outside as well as from the inside, whereby it can even create musical tones itself. Consequently, it is completely normal for a child to start humming harmoniously shortly after birth, even in the form of melodies which it has already absorbed from the outside into its brain and memory as an embryo, as a fetus, or as an infant growing up effectively in the womb. Which music will predominate in the child or in adolescence or adulthood depends on the one hand on what was imparted to him by the mother in the womb, but on the other hand also on many other factors, such as education, the environment, the thought-feel-psych-mental consciousness world, the circle of acquaintances and friends, the direction of work, training, the form of society and membership in groups and organizations, a religion, or sect. The intuition for music is shared by all people, except those who suffer from rare neurological diseases, and therefore every human being is basically musical. However, it should be noted that those people who have a neurologically disturbed relationship to the harmony of music, and as a result, because brain physiological damage factors are present, cannot evaluate harmonic sounds and tones as such. They are subsequently attached to disharmony and followers of disharmonious noises, wild roaring, howling, which they consider to be singing, banging, nerve-wracking discord and harmonic discrepancy, etc. Music has a very big influence on the human brain. Therefore, for example, cheerful pieces of music, a concert or a dance style reduce the concentration of the stress hormone cortisol in the blood. The use of music as medicine can have very good effects, for example, after a stroke or brain trauma. Through music, movements can be coordinated again, and with tinnitus, specially processed music can make the noises in the ears disappear again. Aggression, Alzheimer's, or other dementias, as well as behavioral disorders, can be alleviated by special harmonic music and singing together, but relevant music can also bring back memories. Harmonic music of all kinds can give life an emotional hold again, make life easier or bearable. And when people are constantly sprinkled with harmonious music, such as at work, this contributes to a much greater willingness to work, stamina, and performance. So man is closely interwoven with harmonic music because it gives him an emotional core that remains in him even when certain parts of his personality are already damaged and his memories become weaker. The fact is that harmonic music, which can be classical, pop, or folk, etc., but never disharmonic according to unmusical noises and dissonances, etc., has a shaping effect on brain structures. Harmonic music even creates a promotion of intelligence, contrary to the stupid and false assertion of terrestrial psychology that intelligence is not changeable and not expandable. With harmonic music, man can improve his mental, emotional, psychological world as well as other functions, whereby he only has to choose the right music and devote himself to it. In this way, everyone can do a certain amount of self-treatment if they allow themselves to be sprinkled with the harmonious music that is right for them during the course of the day, at work and in their leisure time. But this only works effectively with good harmonic music, which can be classical, pop, or folk, as well as harmonic pop, metal sound, and jazz, etc., but not with the already mentioned disharmony of negative noises, banging, howling, and roaring, etc. Music affects the hypothalamus via the auditory nerves, influences vegetative functions, and causes a complete exchange with cognitive levels of the brain, because listening to music causes vegetative changes. Basically, listening to music can be based on 8 different aspects, with the following effects occurring. 1. Associative listening to music. The activity of consciousness is more intense. 2. Sentimental listening to music. Memories triggering thought-feeling emotions. 3. Compensatory listening to music, controlling the mood. 4. Motor listening to music triggers body movements. 5. Vegetative listening to music. Conceptual thinking hardly plays a role, but the music is reduced to pure physicality, equal sign dull stomach feeling, goosebumps, shivers, etc. 6. Emotional listening to music. Body excitation is perceived semantically, specifically as fear, joy, grief, etc. 7. Distancing or structural listening to music, consciously following the music through, distancing, contemplative, submerging music. 8. Diffuse listening to music, distance from the music. Music is perceived as disturbing. Music can trigger many different forms of behavior, as was explained at the beginning of this article, and can therefore trigger a wide variety of positive or negative actions and behavior depending on the type of harmonic music or disharmonic sound. In a very positive way, Harmonic music can have an extremely mood-lifting effect on the psychic world of thoughts and feelings, and thus even as a means of systematically treating and remedying depressions, if the right music is chosen that appeals to the person. Similar to a painkiller, Mozart music, for example, can work against headaches, while another composition, which makes one day painless or happy, causes pain or sadness the next day, depending on the moral condition. Music can also help well with severe psychosomatic symptoms as well as in psychiatry, because the mental, emotional effects of music are particularly useful for suffering people. Furthermore, good. Harmonic music is a strong means to challenge people emotionally in a variety of ways. Because through it, the inner defense becomes permeable, which is basically more or less given to every person for various things. Through good harmonious music of any kind, unpleasant or pleasant thoughts and feelings as well as emotions can be perceived, dissolved, and switched off, built up, and permitted. Through good harmonic music. And it is really only good and harmonic music that is meant not only thoughts, feelings, and emotions can be conveyed to people, but also a comprehensive communication can be achieved without words and actions. And this is possible both among people who cannot speak, but who are also not able to communicate linguistically because they speak another language. The same is true if such therapies are carried out, with regard to music therapies for sufferings and diseases, as well as for dementia, and even for people in a vegetative state. A lack of communication can be extended by good music and can help in the physical, psychological, and conscious development of people, both young children and adolescents and adults. Also, through good and harmonious sounds, deficits of many thought, feel, psych, mental, moderate forms can be compensated. As well as in disorders of mother-child relationships, something is stimulated, which was neglected early in the development of the child and normally already from the pregnancy, but latest after the birth by the mother should be carried out. Unfortunately, however, many mothers and fathers try to draw the attention of their newborn babies and then of the growing child to themselves and to produce a one-sided monologue, which they mistakenly believe to be communication, but thereby create more distance between themselves and the child with their baby language than just a valuable relationship and connection. By means of vociferous portrayals and unwise exaggerations in their usual way of speaking. Reasonable words. A reasonable language spoken to babies and children should be as much as it is with adults, as you have already explained in your educational book. Because every baby language and other infant language creates harmful influences in the children with regard to language behavior, etc., which have a lifelong effect. And when it is mistakenly thought that the baby language, toddler language, the loud pictorial and loud dazzling language of the parents form an origin of music, then this does not correspond to reality, but to a completely wrong assumption. The fact is, however, that music has always strengthened people's thoughts and feelings of togetherness, and continues to do so in the future. Already very early hominids made music together. By rough singing and by rhythmic knocking on hollow fruits, pieces of wood, bones, and stones, etc., even if this is not known by earthly researchers and scientists like paleontologists, etc. They also performed dances which made them happy and strengthened their social structures, and also led to a dopamine release in the brain.
What today's youth and even many adults afford today as music is catastrophic and has nothing to do with good, harmonic, and music at all anymore. It is no more than an explosive that numbs the ears and poisons the consciousness as well as the thought-feeling psycho world and even makes the body ill. And if the whole thing is seen from a clear point of view, then there is the evil intention behind it, not only to bring about the end of good, harmonious, and valuable music, but also to destroy the entire traditional Occidental culture, such as the valuable interpersonal relationships and the general social context of the people of the Western world. The Western man is downright stultified and made extremely aggressive by, as you said, unmusical missounding and disease-causing noises, by howling, whining, and smashing, which is madly called and understood as music. It's not only ghastly pop and catastrophically bad heavy metal music, lousy hits, but also new jazz, etc., which makes the good harmonic music sink into the sidelines, like good classical music, hits, good pop, rock, and good metal, as well as folk music, etc. And not only humans suffer from all that is unmusical, but also animals and birds, etc., which become ill and disturbed by the unmusical noises, the roaring, howling, and roaring, etc. Like humans, they react accordingly to the nerve-killing and health-damaging riots and the discord of unmusic, which, in relation to humans, have a very damaging effect on their intelligence, thoughts, feelings, and psyche, as well as a negative effect on their consciousness and a destructive effect on their social behavior. In addition, hard, aggressive unmusic not only weakens the learning ability of humans, animals, and mammals, but it also slowly and continuously disturbs and destroys social behavior in every respect, especially in relation to those people who are not particularly blessed with intelligence. And these are exactly those who do not understand that the riot and racket that thunders out into the country from the abused instruments, like the verbal garbage that swells from the mouths of the roaring, howling, yelling, and screaming unmusicians, drives fellow men in the world of all forms of fauna life to madness. This is completely in contrast to good, harmonic, and valuable music of any kind, which delights those people's senses and psyche, who are significantly more developed and sensitive beings and who have progressed further in their lives in intelligence and social terms than the unmusicians of any kind. The unmusicians are stupid and drive people into dullness through their disharmonic unmusic and make them submissive to foreign influences. So it is no coincidence that intellectuals lead the movement that was launched in the 1960s, and whose ideology is to bring about the destruction of traditional Western values, and thus Western culture, influenced and inspired by the communist teachings of Karl Marx, by pretending to cultivate and demand freedom. Basically, they want to spread communist culture, Marxism, all over the world, and use their academic influence to wage a covert psychological war against Western culture. In Switzerland, the EU fanatics, who are criminally trying to have Switzerland incorporated into the EU dictatorship, also act in roughly the same framework. Because like the intellectual goal mentioned above with regard to the destruction of Western culture, the one demanding EU membership is the one who calls himself Swiss, but they are nothing more than traitors to their homeland. The most urgent endeavor is to systematically destroy Switzerland and its democratic, neutral, liberal, peaceful, and secure foundations, and to force the country and its people under the EU dictatorship. All of them are greasy quislings who truly do not trust in everything that is good in Switzerland and do not acknowledge it either, but rather betray it abysmally and fundamentally no longer have any moral values, because they are deluded of standing above reason and reason. These are all people who as a rule corrupt themselves extremely easily, and who allow themselves to be forced, unthinkingly by false dictatorial-trimmed EU whispers under the canine yoke of a violent new order which truly corresponds to a totalitarian, absolutist criminal coercive system. The traitors of Switzerland's mercies are clearly and unequivocally the arch-enemies of democracy, peace, freedom, and security, and in truth no more and no less than puppets of the dictatorial, sneaky EU power and its false propaganda, not being aware of this fact in their lack of necessity. They don't notice and don't understand that as EU enlightened, they are trapped in the tentacles of the EU dictatorship and walk on the path that is supposed to make Switzerland undemocratic, unfree, unsettled, and insecure, and force the population into a dictatorship and also be judged by foreign EU judges. One could almost laugh at such an audacious idiocy on the part of EU fanatics, because after all, Switzerland's accession to the EU would do immense damage to these firecrackers themselves, which would shock them. However, and would be the first to be annoyed by the EU's dictatorial measures directed against their personal freedom. And they would also be annoyed if they were addressed with mockery by those who warned them. But I have deviated from the actual theme concerning the might of the music. Therefore, I would still like to say the following regarding this. The knowledge of the might of the music is very old and was already described early on in various writings, and so the good and harmonious might of the music had already influenced the antique advanced civilizations, brought their civilizations to a rise. However, also sealed again their decline and their extinction as well as their disappearance from the scene. When the might of the discords of the unmusic arose and brought wars as well as depravity of the human beings and destruction, etc., it is also written in the Bible that in biblical times the Israelites are said to have brought down the walls of Jericho by the sound of trumpets, which only corresponds to a religious fable but proves that music has been ascribed power in various areas since time immemorial. Much older, however, are the writings of the Indian Vedas, which deal with the power and effect of music on human beings, as described by the philosophers and physicians of ancient Greece, and which have already used certain sounds, keys, and music to combat psychological disorders. Also, diverse old philosophers, like for example Confucius, have taught, and also said about the power of music and its manifold influence on people in general and on society in particular. Why the various forms of good and harmonic music have had different effects on people's intelligence since time immemorial, promote it and refine and evolutionize the thoughts, feelings, psyche, and consciousness. Or that in the case of unmusic and missing as well as their sounding noise, buttering, howling, everything degenerates to the contrary in a malicious and damaging way. Contrary to healing through good, harmonic music, as your father Svath has already explained to me, which I still remember well, even educated people can be transformed into almost mindless, stupid people through dull, disharmonic music. And this would be the case in the years to come when, from the 1970s and 1980s onwards, such unmusic would emerge and spread within a few years, and as a result many people would become unworldly, socially poor and in a vicious form completely unrelated to all values relating to their fellow human beings and humanity as well as helpfulness, living together in life itself, which would even lead to the value of one's own life being disregarded and trampled underfoot. But your father also said at that time that the structure and norms of society would break apart as a result of the emerging unmusic, as well as that mammon and money would take absolutely uncontrollable forms with regard to people's greed, and would cause an enormous amount of disaster in the form of bankruptcies, corporate collapses, wars, family destruction, terrorism and sectarianism, disputes, murders, and innumerable other forms of degeneration. He also mentioned the refugee problem, which is becoming uncontrollable as a result of the greed for money, luxury, and prosperity of people in third world countries, etc., triggered by the hatred and unreasonableness of European leaders. Already towards the end of the 1940s, he made many predictions, which according to me then also wrote the various other predictions and sent them all over the world, but which did not change anything about world events, because nothing reacted to the predictions, and nothing was changed for the better. But enough of that, because I want to say what Svath has explained to me further, such as that certain unmusic in the brain and body as well as in the psyche and consciousness of humans causes serious damage to health, which also affects blood pressure and pulse in the heart, which can even cause a heart attack. The rhythm of the drums alone, your father explained, can damage or at least weaken the organism, not only in humans, but also in animals, all animals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, etc., even a very specific rhythm of very extremely bad unmusic, which would be used frequently in the future from the 1970s and 1980s onwards, would cause special degenerating behavior patterns and health damage in people. The whole thing of miserable unmusic demolishes the mental, emotional, psychological world of all those people, who are manipulated and thus have a direct influence on society and change it in an abysmally negative way. And that more and more crimes are emerging from everything, up to increased murder and suicide rates, increased sex crimes and family tragedies, acts of terrorism and war, etc., as Svath said, that actually proves itself with everything that is happening today. But what I would like to say in relation to music, music also settles informatively in the water, as the Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto proved, who played distilled water with different music in the order of Mozart's Symphony No. 40, Bach's Goldberg variations as well as Japanese pop songs and heavy metal music, then let it freeze, and then photographed the beautiful water crystals created by the musical vibrations. So water and music have a much closer relationship than people generally know. Also, that low forms of life are musical, such as jellyfish, is usually not included in human general knowledge, nor is it the case that whales are singing creatures and do a lot for Earth with their singing that swings far through the oceans. There is a lot more to be said about how good, harmonious and therefore right musical sounds stimulate plants and promote their growth, but how unpleasant, disharmonic music has a very negative effect on plants, amphibians, animals, reptiles and birds, and how they are also damaged physically and psychologically by general disharmony in their environment. Note Billy. The following can be found on the internet at Wikipedia. Emoto has been involved with water since the early 1990s. He was of the opinion that water could absorb and store the influences of thoughts and feelings. He came to this conclusion through experiments with bottled water, which he labeled either with positive messages such as thank you or negative messages such as war, and then froze, photographed and judged the resulting ice crystal on the basis of aesthetic morphological criteria. Thus he tried to show a connection between the appearance of the ice crystal and the quality or condition of the water. According to his theory, water labeled with positive messages always forms perfect ice crystals, while water labeled with negative messages assumes imperfect crystal forms. The known basics of crystallization of snowflakes' shape depending on temperature were ignored. Emoto's assertions, together with other approaches by Victor Schauberger, Johann Grander and others, which have been described as para- or pseudoscientific, form the starting point for the treatment, production, and marketing of so-called revitalized water and equipment for water revitalization. Emoto Masaru, born July 22, 1943 in Yokohama, Japan, died October 17, 2014 in Tokyo, was a Japanese parascientist and alternative physician.
You speak in my mind, and what my father explained to you I can only confirm.
Then today I read an article in the Oberlander Zeitung describing the fact that a large number of murders are not recognized by the police, doctors, and pathologists. In 2004, both of us had already spoken privately and officially about this, as this excerpt from the discussion report shows, on which this newspaper article provides new information.
Excerpt from the 369th Contact Conversation of the 12th of November, 2004. Pages 335 to 336. Plagadisch Kontaktberichte, Volume 9.
Which I wanted to ask you. On your last visit, you said something on the quiet about undiscovered murders in Switzerland and Germany. However, since our conversation on this subject was purely private, it was unfortunately not mentioned in the report, and I think it would perhaps be right for us to talk about it officially after all.
But I still want to comply with your wish and take up what has been said again. With regard to undiscovered murders, I said that around 400 murders are committed annually in Switzerland and around 4,500 in Germany, or in part of the old Federal Republic of Germany, each year, against people who can never be proven to have committed such murders, because the carelessness of doctors and police means that there are no grounds for suspecting that murder crimes have been committed. In this respect, unneeded doctors issue death certificates based on false causes of death, while the responsible police authorities handle their investigations so inattentively that they overlook or misinterpret all signs of the murders. Money greed, hatred, jealousy, and legacy hiding are the main reasons for these undiscovered murders. What you say is correct, although I still have a good memory of the conversation, also because I am still interested in this matter. So I can tell you that I know that both in Switzerland and in Germany, but also worldwide, the number of these undiscovered murders has risen very sharply since 2004. Often the murders are committed by close relatives and by relatives or other usufructuaries, who mainly out of greed murder the testators in various ways, but these murders often go undetected. There are fewer cases of compassionate murders when people are old and bedridden, sick and dying. Many of these murders remain undiscovered and unpunished because the doctors and forensic doctors, pathologists and police, etc., are too inattentive, naive, trustworthy, and biased in relation to the investigation of these crimes, and are biased towards the mourners and bereaved.
You already said that during our private conversation in 2004, and nothing has changed in any way since then. There is also no change with regard to the criminal spraying of poisons with regard to herbicides and pesticides. Because once again, the time has come for the health authorities and the EU dictatorship to legalize the best-selling herbicide glyphosate in Europe and declare it harmless to human health. Consequently, it can be spread in rough quantities and poison the natural foods, the food plants, which are then eaten and poisoned by humans. Glyphosate is used not only in Switzerland, but throughout Europe and even throughout the world on fields and green areas, in orchards, on railway embankments, and in private gardens. The pesticide glyphosate is found in products such as Roundup, Typhoon, Wellkill, or Capito, and is available in the garden departments of Migros, Coop, Landy, Jumbo, or Hornbach. If you can say something again in detail about glyphosate and its effect, as well as about the whole drum and turn of the today's production and the distribution, etc. As far as I know, various companies today produce the poison, worldwide, for example in China. If you are able to explain something in detail and in a language that even lay people can understand, for example, what insights you have gained from your research into glyphosate and other poisons that are used in agriculture and horticulture, etc., as well as in general in the form of herbicides and pesticides, which are applied on Earth and poison everything.
Glyphosate-containing weed killers are used by the ton, not only in agriculture but also by domestic gardeners, horticulturists, and hobby gardeners. Glyphosate products are manufactured by the notorious genetic engineering group Monsanto. The harmful effects on nature, fauna, flora, and humans are not only trivialized and played down but also vehemently denied. Anyone who can prove the harmfulness of substances containing glyphosate in relation to humans and other life forms is silenced by Monsanto's lawyers. Glyphosate, however, is very harmful and also causes cancer, whereby it is not only probably carcinogenic, but inevitably causes cancer, for which even the tiniest amounts in the nanoscale are sufficient, as well as for many other ailments and diseases which affect humans and animals, etc. The use of the herbicide in any form is not only extremely dangerous to the health of all consumers and therefore dangerous, but also to their users and consumers such as farmers, horticulturists, plantation operators, house gardeners and hobby gardeners, etc., etc. Our researchers can detect glyphosate and its degradation substances at least in nanoscale regions in the air, in the rain, and even in the atmosphere, as well as in higher nanodoses in groundwater and in the human body, and in countless life forms of all genera and species. Glyphosate is therefore a weed killer for the Monsanto Group, as we have already talked about. And this toxin is a very dangerous carcinogen of the worst kind, even the tiniest nanoparticles being enough to damage the organism of humans, animals, and all forms of life. Glyphosate-containing weed killers are not only produced by the notorious genetic engineering group Monsanto, but also elsewhere, and they are used by tons by corporations of various kinds and by authorities for weed killing. The harmful, life-threatening, and even life-destroying effects on nature, fauna, and flora, as well as on humans, are deliberately played down or even denied by criminals. And anyone who can prove that glyphosate is harmful in this respect will be silenced by Monsanto's lawyers. Because the herbicide glyphosate is a billion-dollar business for the manufacturer of the seed and genetic engineering group Monsanto, based in St. Louis in the U.S. state of Missouri. Glyphosate-containing weed killers are so-called broad-spectrum herbicides, which are toxic to almost all plant species. These toxins have also been produced by other numerous companies since patent protection expired, so that half of the poison supply today comes from China. Glyphosate is one of the most widely used herbicide active ingredients in the world. Although it must be said quite clearly that with regard to the world-famous Roundup, it is in itself much more toxic than its active ingredient glyphosate. And this is because the formula also contains various other toxins, such as formaldehyde, which produces the so-called cocktail effect, which results in a mixture that is much more dangerous and toxic than the individual components alone. As a result, when people in all forms of life come into contact with this mixture and the various toxins penetrate their bodies through the pores, mucous membranes, respiratory tract, and food, the organs and blood are contaminated with all these toxins, which inevitably leads to overall organic damage. This is also the case when in the beginning, which can sometimes last for years. Depending on the amount of poison that has penetrated the organism, usually only at the nanoscale, no or only minor ailments and diseases develop. Over time, however, these can result in serious damage, including cancer. It must therefore be emphasized again and again that in the human organism and in all forms of life, even the smallest amounts of toxic substances are harmful to health even in the nanoscale range and lead to serious suffering and diseases and ultimately to death. It should be noted that as a rule, doctors only rarely recognize the origin of the diseases. And if they still find the cause, then it is too late for the patients because they can no longer be cured of their health damage. Over the years, the effect of glyphosate and the entire mixture on humans, amphibians, fish, animals, reptiles, mammals, and birds has become more extensive, more dangerous, more pathogenic, and more deadly. But this is denied by the manufacturer and the scientific experts he bought, who allegedly investigated the effects of glyphosate and its mixtures and, of course, contrary to the effective truth, could not find any danger for humans and all other life forms. As a rule, it has been said and still is said that if glyphosate or Roundup and all other toxins were used as intended, there would be no health risks for humans and other forms of life, apart from those which would have to be combated, although the opposite would be the case, which is vehemently denied on the one hand. On the other hand, however, the hazardousness of the toxins cannot be determined by the relevant physicians, pathologists, and other specialists, because in still small quantities in the nano range, which are already harmful to health, the toxins cannot be determined due to the lack of analytical ability or are simply concealed if their determination is already possible. And this often happens through so-called doctors and researchers, etc., who are paid horrendously for their silence or their false statements and lies. So it happens that the poison production companies, like Monsanto, the producer of glyphosate, its mixture and other toxins, very quickly go on the counterattack, if not professionals paid by bribes, like private scientists and universities, etc., conduct and publish studies which expose glyphosate, its mixtures and other poisons as harmful and even deadly for humans, animals and animals, etc. If they do not do so, the poison production companies, like for example Monsanto, its mixture and other toxins. Critical researchers and scientists are simply discredited or, if necessary, gagged with threats or violently silenced by the Monsanto Group, as is practically the case with all other toxin product manufacturers. Our research has shown that glyphosate, including its mixtures, is highly toxic to all soils, plants, waters, humans, and all life forms. However, this is also often the case with other toxins, but especially with glyphosate and accumulation of carcinomas or tumors. Growths, nodules, cancer, tumors, and growths of the kidney tubules or the small renal tubules or urinary tubules in the kidneys occurs in the human body, as with various other forms of life. Malignant tumors and tumors in the pancreas also develop in the supporting and connective tissue as a result of even the tiniest nanomagnets of the herbicide, as do skin cancer, lung cancer, and lymph gland cancer to an increased extent. Glyphosate is therefore indisputably a carcinogen, even in the smallest nano amounts. But that is not all, because our research shows that even the tiniest amounts of glyphosate and all the mixed toxins contained in it cause serious damage in the nanoscale nucleus of the DNA and in the chromosomes of humans, animals and all animals, etc., in the nanoscale range, which also causes autism and physical deformity, especially in offspring growing up in the womb. In agriculture, plantations and horticulture, vegetables, winter rape, pulses, winter barley, and summer cereals in particular are sprayed with the toxin glyphosate, which then settles in these natural foods and poisons the people and other life forms that eat from them. Today, glyphosate or other poison residues are present in practically all staple foods, such as vegetables, oats, maize, soya, wheat, and sugar, etc., and thus in practically all flour products, including pasta and bakery products. The fact that people and all forms of life are poisoned and made suffering and ill with the poison glyphosate, also with other toxins, is of course denied by the toxin production companies. But what happens in agriculture and commercial horticulture is that before sowing, the fields and gardens are sprayed with glyphosate or other toxins to free them from wild plants and weeds that are classified as weeds, which is done before harvesting specifically by Roundup to speed up the ripening of crops. The bottom line is that naturally toxic and carcinogenic residues settle and accumulate in plant food and foodstuffs, which are then consumed by humans. After harvesting, the herbicide is also sprayed on the stubble to prevent weed growth before soil tillage. The Roundup is also marketed under the brand name Glyphos or Glypho-Uncraut X and is of course also used for private use in gardens, as well as a garage space or garden path to keep house walls, walkways, stairs, and squares, etc., free of weeds. In principle, this should not be allowed because glyphosate should only be used by competent persons with a corresponding certificate of proof. This should at least be the case, but this is usually not observed anywhere when buying small quantities. Not even if you buy more than 1 liter bottle or even a 5-liter canister of the poison, because these are cheaper than small quantities. The poison can be bought unhindered everywhere, where it is just sold, because usually, if at all, the buyers are informed only about the fact that they should not buy the means, actually, because it is not permitted for the house and house garden range and private range, and because it might be acquired basically only by phytosanitary specialists. As a rule, these are people who have relevant professional training and experience and a phytosanitary examination, such as gardeners, farmers, or persons who have passed a corresponding examination. Such tests should also make it clear that toxins, of whatever kind, should never be present in car parking lots, paved garage spaces, yards, squares and paths, etc., because, in any case, there is always a risk that they will wash into water and massively impair and poison the ecosystem, as happens when they are spread into fields, gardens, and meadows, etc., because the poisons seep into the groundwater and, sooner or later, reach the plant spray water and drinking water in this way. Unfortunately, however, no purchaser of glyphosate or other poisons is required to indicate exactly where they will use the toxins. So they buy the various poisons, or even the most dangerous glyphosate, and spray with it very generously everything that comes before the spray nozzle to them. If rain is then added, the glyphosate or other poison is flushed into the next drain or ditch, where the highly toxic substances drain into the water and poison it. Depending on the amount of glyphosate or other poisons in the water, almost everything that grows and lives and comes into contact with the poisoned water, or is contaminated by it, through bathing or drinking, is poisoned and destroyed. Regardless of whether it is algae, amphibians, pure bottom plants, fish, beetles, dragonfly larvae, newts, reptiles, birds, aquatic plants or vertebrates, or even humans. Although humans are neither amphibians nor other forms of life in the wild, what they are able to kill with toxins is harmful to their health and does not leave them untouched, even to the point of death. And even if the glyphosate or other toxins, even if only in the nanoscale, slowly but surely develop into incurable cancer over the years. Earth humans must protect themselves and their environment from weed killers, with the Roundup and its continuation products in the first place, but also all other toxins of all kinds that must not be forgotten. In principle, care must be taken to ensure that regional foodstuffs from an effectively high-quality organic cultivation are used, because these are largely protected from herbicides such as Roundup, as well as from pesticide contamination. However, this does not mean that organic products can be absolutely protected from toxins, but kept, planted, bred, grown, and harvested in a state that contains an absolute minimum of toxins. These move in minimal nano areas, which of course does not prevent suffering and diseases, but can minimize them. It should be borne in mind that minute amounts of toxins of all kinds are also contained in the air, in rainwater and groundwater, and thus in splash water for the organic products, even if these cannot be detected by earthly analysis equipment, which is still very inadequate as a result of the minute quantities of nanomaterials of herbicides and pesticides, at least not yet today. It must also be said that many wild plants that have fallen into disrepute as weeds, provided they are edible for humans, have a much higher nutritional value than any cultivated vegetable.
In 1971, Monsanto patented glyphosate as a herbicide, and since then the Roundup alone has generated annual sales of $2 billion. I have read about this, as well as that in Switzerland alone 300 tons of glyphosate are sold each year, poisoning fields, gardens and private gardens, waters as well as roads, railway embankments, paths and meadows, whereas in Germany, according to surveys by the University of Göttingen, glyphosate is currently sprayed on 39% of the arable land. However, the poison companies deny any connection with their poisons and the health damages of many people. But according to a new study, this is no longer so easy because it, carried out by the International Agency for Research on Cancer IRC, an institution of the WHO, proves the opposite. The study was published in March 2015 in the journal Lancet Oncology, highlighting 5 organophosphates used as herbicides or pesticides that are highly carcinogenic, including the herbicide glyphosate, which is classified in the 2A group, which includes substances that definitely cause cancer in humans, animals, getaways, and all life forms. This study is a meta-study conducted since 2001 and relates to various studies in the USA, Canada, and Sweden. Cancer experts from 11 countries unanimously concluded that Roundup causes cancer in animals. What happens to people in this regard was probably also taken into consideration, but what this has resulted in is clear.
I am aware of that, but the companies producing toxins are probably not deterred by it.
You're probably right, because they have tremendous power that reaches as far as the governments, where various bribes are addicted, who hold out their hollow hands.
That is undeniably so, therefore I have nothing about it. Wait a minute, Eduard. Excuse me, Florina has briefly told me a number of things that are currently happening in Paris through a large-scale terrorist act of the Islamist State, which is causing many deaths. But I don't want to talk about that now, because after our conversation you can watch.
I will do what I want to say right now, before I know exactly what is going on in Paris. That the powerful of the government in France, as in the EU dictatorship as a whole, as in the USA, etc., will only use stupid phrases again, instead of finally doing what is absolutely necessary. I am talking about the fact that the states of the world should finally get together and urgently set up a multinational peace struggle force. I am sure that now that a major IS terrorist act is taking place in Paris, Putin will at least offer his help to France and propose something like a foundation stone for an alliance similar to a country-aligned combat force. But what results from this is written in the stars. But as I imagine Hollande, the president of France, will hardly or not at all respond to Putin's proposal, but rather stupidly request military aid from the EU dictatorship. This is the case while in the EU dictatorship states the big gibbering begins with the powerful and they want to better secure the borders of their countries and only admit strictly controlled refugees, or no refugees at all, into the country. And furthermore, it is probably correct when I say that at least the majority of these stupidly stupid statesmen as well as the state security services remain naive and claim that the Islamic terrorists of the IS would not enter Europe under the guise of refugees, as I said months ago and also published in Kontaktberichten on the internet. The success of ignoring the warning now seems to be beginning in Paris, which will certainly continue in other EU states, with Germany, in my view, being a next target, as will other EU dictatorship states. It can also be assumed that in the longer term, Switzerland will not be spared either, and that even before and especially since the refugee immigration to Europe, which was triggered by Angela Merkel, IS, and Al-Qaeda sleepers, along with many criminals have been all over Europe. And Switzerland is not excluded from this either, although especially Belgium, Germany, and France are in the crosshairs of this terrorism, which is still diligently swept under the carpet by the naive and autocratic state authorities and state security services, but which will all still be very expensive. So, on the one hand, they continue to muddle through in this way for so long and do not clean out the sleeper nests. Do not smoke them out and do not render the rabble harmless until they carry out murderous actions and murder many innocent human lives. So the sleepers in all European countries are left at large, a little watched and left unscathed until they are able to freely carry out their religiously sectarian hate fanatical degenerations, to carry out their murder deeds and bring unspeakable suffering to innocent people. On the other hand, jihadists, Al-Qaeda and other terrorists and Islamist IS murderers, as well as criminals and effective serious criminals, will continue to be admitted to Europe unhindered as refugees because, on the one hand, an irresponsible Angela Merkel has unstoppably torn this in her criminal actions and, on the other hand, is doing everything she can to ensure that the refugee disaster continues and the refugee misery can spread further. Furthermore, it turns out that all the Islamic criminal creatures are touched with velvet gloves, at most only shadowed and tolerated, instead of being touched, arrested, and put under lock and key for a very long time. And while I am at the power of the rulers, I would like to mention that the powerful of the states who are now intervening in Syria with their air forces and supplying the civil war party with weapons and ammunition earn a lot of money with it. This also happens with regard to the Islamist state, which is criminally equipped and supplied with war material by unscrupulous arms dealers and religiously sectarian fanatical state leaders of certain states. You have also told me that in Syria the bombardments are carried out with old bombs, which are removed from the camps, as well as the old weapons and the old ammunition, in order to be able to put new and modern war material into them. So the old stocks of bombs, ammunition, and weapons are used for expensive money against the IS, etc., or delivered to combat units in order to get rid of old and obsolete stocks, and to produce new ones, and to replenish the camps with modern bombs, weapons, and new ammunition. This, of course, promotes the flourishing of the arms and ammunition industry, and alleviates unemployment.
What you're saying is undeniable fact in fact. But now, dear friend, I still have a few things to discuss privately with you, about which we have talked several times, but for which there is something new. The thing is,
There is no...
I'm afraid that's how it is, but...
I agree, but I would like to say the following about that.
That is indeed so, but now I must go back again. Farewell and goodbye, Eduard.
Well, farewell, Ptaah, and goodbye.